The first sign that something was terribly wrong with my son was the way he fought to control his breathing. It was not loud or frantic, but quiet and restrained, like a man using every ounce of strength he had left, just to keep from falling apart in public. That was how the evening began. Porch. My son, Harlan, sat across from me at his in-laws' lavish dining table, surrounded by expensive linens and polished silverware. His chest rose and fell too quickly, his eyes darted around the room, and his hands trembled with a tremor he could barely hide. My name is Josephine Blake. Porch. I raised my boy alone in suburban Connecticut, and that night every steady piece of my life slipped away into a nightmare I never saw coming. The chandelier overhead hummed with a sharp, persistent buzz that felt like a quiet alarm. The room smelled of roasted rosemary chicken and expensive Napa Valley Cabernet, but beneath it all was the sharp, sour scent of pure tension. Porch. It radiated off my son in waves. Beside him sat his wife Sierra, wearing a smile that was far too tight and practiced. Her mother, Patricia Hayes, poured wine with slow, deliberate precision, never once taking her eyes off Harlan. Across the table sat Leonard Hayes, Harlan's father-in-law, watching my boy with the heavy, unblinking focus of a man who had already decided his next move. Porch. Then, under the table, Harlan reached out and gripped my hand. His fingers were icy, rigid, and desperate. It was not a gentle touch or a casual squeeze. It was the desperate grip of someone drowning. His thumb tapped 3 rapid, frantic beats against my wrist. The chandelier flickered for a fraction of a second. A silver fork clattered against porcelain. Porch. Someone at the table let out a laugh that was entirely too loud, but the only thing I could focus on was the fragile, racing pulse hammering beneath his skin. Without making a sound, he slipped something cold and hard into my palm. It was his iPhone. Porch. He guided it beneath my napkin and pressed it onto my lap, passing it to me like a burning secret he needed me to protect before it consumed him completely. He kept his eyes straight ahead, his voice barely holding together, as he whispered, "Mom, do not argue. Just take it." Under the table, his knee was shaking uncontrollably. Porch. I held my breath, barely moving my lips as I answered, "Harlan, honey, what is going on?" He gave a single, firm shake of his head and tightened his grip on my fingers. Across from us, Leonard stood up without a word and walked into the hallway. He did not say excuse me, and he did not smile. He moved with the quiet authority of someone stepping out to make sure a plan was running on schedule. Porch. Sierra kept cutting her chicken into tiny, perfect squares, but her eyes never drifted from my son. Patricia held her wine glass still, as if counting down the seconds in her head. The tension in that room was suffocating. Beneath the napkin, Harlan's thumb moved across the screen, swiping once. On my lap, the phone vibrated with a soft pulse. Then another. And another. Porch. He was finalizing something permanent. His breath caught in his throat. "Mom," he whispered, "you are the only person I trust." A cold knot tightened in my chest. The edges of the room seemed to blur. My heart missed a beat, leaving me entirely cold. I leaned toward him and murmured, "Please, do not pull me into anything dangerous. I am asking you, please." Porch. I touched his hand and he finally looked up at me. His eyes were glassy, broken, and filled with unmistakable terror. "Mom, I might be in serious danger." My mouth went completely dry. My pulse roared in my ears as every protective instinct I had as a mother screamed at once. What happened next is a moment that will stay with me for the rest of my days. My son never said another word. Porch. Leonard returned from the hallway, his face composed and tightly controlled, wearing the expression of a man whose plans were unfolding exactly as expected. Sierra's shoulders went rigid. Patricia smoothed her linen napkin with a subtle, satisfied motion. Then Harlan stood up, moving entirely too fast. Porch. The legs of his chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor, cutting through the silence like broken glass. He cleared his throat and forced a tight, shaky smile. "It has been a long day. I just need to step outside for some fresh air." His voice cracked on the final word. Sierra's jaw tightened. Leonard froze in place. Patricia blinked slowly, like someone checking off a box. Porch. My son leaned down, pressed a gentle kiss to the crown of my head, and whispered in a fragile voice, "I will call you later." He turned and walked out. Nobody stopped him. Nobody called his name. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind him, and that was the very last time I ever saw my son alive. Porch. When I finally walked out of that massive house, the night air felt heavy, as if the atmosphere itself held secrets I had not yet unraveled. I clutched Harlan's phone tightly inside my purse, where it felt heavy against my side. I did not look at the screen. My breathing was ragged as I hurried over to my old Volvo, sat in the driver's seat, and dialed his number before even pulling on my seatbelt. Porch. Ring. Ring. You have reached voicemail. His recorded greeting played back to me, warm and steady, recorded long before fear had taken hold of his life. Hearing it felt like a physical blow. I hung up and dialed again and again and again. By the fourth try, my hands were shaking so hard I misdialed twice. I wiped the cold sweat from my palms onto my skirt and tried once more. Nothing. Porch. Just the same empty tone. I drove home like a hollow shell. Every traffic light seemed to take an eternity to change. When I walked through my front door, the house was dark and quiet. I did not bother turning on the lights. I did not want comfort, I just wanted an answer. I sat on the edge of the living room sofa, replaying every second of that dinner in my head. Porch. His cold hands, his trembling voice, the quiet way he whispered as though even his breath was being monitored. And then came the guilt, thick and bitter, rising in my throat. I remembered the slight edge of impatience in my voice when I told him not to drag me into trouble. I had not meant to sound harsh, I was just terrified. But regret does not wait for an explanation. It simply punishes you. Porch. I should have followed him out that door. I should have demanded he tell me everything right there on the driveway. I should have taken his hand, put him in my car, and driven as far away from that house as the road would take us. The hours slipped away without mercy. The wall clock ticked with a hollow, relentless rhythm. My eyes remained locked on the front door, waiting for it to swing open. Porch. When fatigue blurred my vision, old memories began to surface. I remembered when he was a little boy, padding into my bedroom in the middle of the night, whispering that he had a bad dream and asking if I would stay with him, and I always did. I would sit beside him, rub his back, and stay until he fell asleep. For years, it was just the two of us. Porch. We split bowls of cereal late at night when money was tight, we held on to each other at his father's service, and when his tech startup secured its very first round of major funding, I was the first person he looked for in the room. My son had always leaned on me. Why had I not realized how much he needed me tonight? A sharp ache gripped my chest. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. Porch. Then 2:30. Then past 3. By 3:47, my mind finally accepted what my heart had been desperately fighting against. Harlan was not ignoring my calls. Something had gone terribly wrong. Still, I kept dialing. Even as my phone battery dropped into the red and my fingers cramped, I pressed his name over and over, as if sheer repetition could somehow pull him back home. Porch. When the screen finally went completely dark, the silence in the room was deafening. I plugged the charger in and stared at the glass until it lit back up. No missed calls, no text messages. Even my final message, begging him to call me because I was worried sick, remained unread. I stayed awake through the entire night. My eyes burned, but my body refused to rest. Porch. I sat by the window, watching the sky shift from pitch black to charcoal gray, and finally into a bruised pale blue. The morning was waking up. Birds began to sing in the trees. Tires hummed along the distant highway, and the streetlights flickered off one by one. Then my phone shattered the quiet. The ringtone was so sudden I nearly dropped it. Porch. I grabbed the device with both hands, my heart pounding against my ribs. The screen did not show Harlan's name. It was an unfamiliar official number. The silence before the connection clicked through felt impossibly heavy. Then came a cold, detached voice that cut straight through me. "This is the police department. Your son was found unresponsive." The drive to their house was a blur of shock. Porch. The world felt tilted, like the ground was falling out from under my feet. When I turned onto their manicured suburban street, flashing red and blue lights were already painting every window in harsh colors. Officers walked with practiced, quiet steps along the driveway, speaking in hushed tones. I parked haphazardly behind a patrol unit and rushed out before the car had even settled. A young officer stepped into my path, wearing a polite professional expression. "Ma'am, this is an active scene. Please stay behind the tape." I did not stop. My legs did not care about yellow tape or official protocol. My boy was somewhere inside that garage, and nothing was going to stand between a mother and her child. "Ma'am," he repeated, raising an arm to block me. "I am his mother," I said, my voice straining against the tightness in my throat. The word made him hesitate, but only for a second. Before he could speak again, she stepped out. Sierra. Her face was streaked with moisture, but her eyes were remarkably clear, completely free of the red swelling that true grief brings. Those tears looked placed there rather than cried out. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second and immediately looked away, as if looking at me was something her conscience could not handle. Her father, Leonard Hayes, stood right beside her. He rested a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder, while keeping his other hand casually tucked into his trouser pocket. For a man standing in the middle of an absolute tragedy, his posture was entirely too calm, too relaxed. He turned toward the officer who was holding me back. "You do not need to let her through. The medical team has already completed their initial assessment." I gripped the side mirror of a nearby police car just to keep myself upright. Leonard walked toward me, his voice carrying a layer of manufactured sympathy. "It was an accident," he said softly. "A terrible, tragic accident. You should really go home and rest." I stared directly into his face. His expression did not waver for a single moment. Sierra leaned against his arm, presenting a unified, rehearsed display of family grief. The officer cleared his throat and repeated the story he had clearly been given. "It appears your son left the vehicle running inside the closed garage. The fumes accumulated quickly. It is an unfortunate and common occurrence." "Common? My son found in a garage he only ever used for long-term storage?" The words caught in my throat. Not because I believed a single word they were saying, but because speaking them out loud would only give these people the satisfaction of seeing me break. Another officer gently guided me back toward the sidewalk. His touch was polite, but his eyes were detached, doing a routine job by the book. I forced my mind to focus, scanning the driveway. The garage door was completely shut, sealed tight and precise. Then my eyes landed on something else. Harlan's car keys were sitting squarely on the hood of Sierra's brother's Porsche, not hanging in an ignition, not lying on the ground where someone might drop them in a panic, but placed flat and centered on the metal. Sierra's brother hurried over and snatched the keys off the hood. When he realized I was watching him, he flinched. He glanced back at Leonard and whispered something so low it was almost lost to the breeze. But grief has a way of sharpening your hearing. At least he signed it. Signed what? My pulse hammered so hard it blurred my vision, but I forced myself to remain completely still. Leonard placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, a subtle, controlling grip meant to demand silence. Then Leonard turned back to me. "We will take care of all the necessary arrangements," he said, wrapping his words in a calm tone that made my skin crawl. "You should be with family right now." I did not move. The officer tried once more. "Ma'am, please, the area is closed. Accident." Closed. Arrangements. Every word they used was neat, prepared, and thoroughly rehearsed. Sierra dabbed at her dry cheeks. "He was just under so much stress lately," she murmured, her tone completely detached from reality. A private medical transport team wheeled a covered gurney out toward the white van. A pale sheet concealed the body of the boy I had brought into this world, and the sight of that quiet shape shattered something inside me that will never be repaired. I took a slow step backward, fighting for every breath. I reached blindly into my purse for support, needing something solid to anchor me to the ground. In that exact moment, the phone inside my bag vibrated against my fingers. Porch. I looked down, blinking back the blur in my eyes to read the screen. It was an urgent, high-security transaction notification from a private banking institution. The alert was clear. $50 million had been transferred into my private holding account. After the memorial service, stepping inside their home felt completely wrong. Porch. It was not because the house was quiet. Loss brings quiet with it. It was because the space showed absolutely no evidence of grief. There were no used tissues, no discarded blankets from sleepless nights, no signs that anyone had spent the past 48 hours mourning the loss of a husband or a partner. Porch. The house was spotless, like a luxury showroom waiting for prospective buyers, not a home where a life had just ended. Sierra walked several paces ahead of me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She did not look back to see if I was managing the stairs, nor did she offer a kind word. She moved with purpose, eager to finish a chore so she could move on to the next chapter of her plans. Porch. You can take this, she said flatly, pointing toward a plain cardboard box resting near the coat closet. It is just some old personal items he had lying around that nobody needs anymore. Her tone carried a polite chill that never reached her eyes. I bent down slowly, my hands trembling as I touched the cardboard. The box was light, far too light to hold 28 years of a human life. Porch. I lifted the corner of the lid just enough to see inside. A few stray documents, a handful of pens, a dried-out highlighter, and a black moleskine notebook with worn edges along the spine. My breath hitched. When Sierra noticed my hand resting on the notebook, her posture stiffened. There is nothing important in there, she added quickly, her voice sharp enough to make my stomach drop. Porch. I lowered the lid, leaving everything inside untouched. I will look through it at home, I said quietly. She gave a tight nod, her jaw setting into a hard line that gave away her irritation. I carried the box out to my car, holding it securely against my chest as if the contents might vanish if I moved too quickly. Porch. Sitting behind the steering wheel, I pulled the door shut and let out the first full breath I had taken since arriving. The air inside the car felt cold and sharp, with the certainty that a massive deception was unfolding. I did not start the engine right away. I placed the box on the passenger seat and lifted the lid. The black notebook was right at the top, plain and silent, waiting for me. Porch. I picked it up with both hands. On the inside cover, Harlan had written his name in the clean, deliberate handwriting he had learned from copying mine as a young boy. I traced my thumb over the dried ink, my chest aching, before turning the page. The early entries were brief notes and practical observations. They are suddenly paying close attention to how I structure my corporate accounts. Porch. Leonard keeps asking how much liquid capital I can pull on short notice. She asked for my primary administrative passwords today, claimed it was for emergency planning. They keep bringing up my total valuation. The handwriting blurred as tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them away and turned another page. Leonard brought over a set of legal forms today. Porch. Said it was standard family estate planning. Something about the terms does not feel right. I pressed my palm flat against the paper, trying to steady my breathing. These were not dramatic accusations. They were a trail of quiet concerns left behind by a man who was always careful, fair, and hesitant to judge without clear facts. I turned to an entry dated just 2 weeks before that final dinner. Porch. She asked again what would happen to the company equity if I were suddenly incapacitated. Why does this topic keep coming up? My heart felt heavy and slow. Every single line was written before that dinner. Before he pressed his phone into my hands. Before he whispered that I was the only person he trusted. Porch. I gripped the notebook tighter, turning page after page, following the trail of realizations he had documented without even knowing where it would lead. Then my fingers stopped at the very last entry. The date at the top matched the day of that final dinner. The handwritten serring was hurried, the ink pressed deep into the paper as if written under immense pressure. Orch, they are demanding that I sign the agreements tonight. I cannot push this off any longer. Directly underneath was a second line, written with heavy, deliberate force. Everything has been redirected. It is safe with Mom. The world around me seemed to stop completely. The silence inside the car was absolute. He had not written those words out of panic. He had written them out of preparation. Orch. He knew the pressure was mounting, but he never could have anticipated the finality of what would follow. A deep, steady chill settled through my bones. For a long time, I could not bring myself to go inside my house. I sat in the driveway with the journal open on my lap, reading those final words over and over. The ink looked as though it had barely dried. Orch. Those were his thoughts just hours before sitting across from me at that table, words he never had the chance to say out loud. I held the notebook against my chest, wrapping my arms around it tightly, wishing with everything I had that holding it close could bring him back. A sound tore from my throat, raw and broken, coming from a place far deeper than tears. Orch. It was the sound of a mother who had raised her son, loved him, and stood by him, only to realize the terrible weight he had been carrying entirely on his own. When the evening began to cool, I finally carried the box inside. The house was spotless and empty, unaware that my world had been permanently dismantled. Porch. I set the journal on the kitchen table and stepped outside onto the front porch just to breathe the cool evening air. The neighborhood was quiet as porch lights began turning on down the street. My neighbor, Mrs. Barker, was watering her front garden. When she saw me standing there, she paused and set her watering can down on the grass. Porch. Josephine, I am so deeply sorry for what you are going through, she said gently, walking toward the low fence between our yards. I did not want to intrude, but I managed a small nod, my voice refusing to work. She stepped a little closer. I saw him out here the evening before everything happened. I turned toward her instantly. You saw Harlan? She nodded slowly. Porch. He was pacing back and forth along the sidewalk right out front. He looked completely overwhelmed, running his hands through his hair while speaking on the phone. It was not an argument, he just looked deeply frightened. Really, truly frightened. The ground beneath me felt unstable. When he noticed me, he stopped. She continued in a soft voice. Porch. He did not say anything, but he held his hand over his chest for a moment like something inside would hurt him terribly. I should have walked over and asked if he needed help. I reached out and placed a hand on her arm. You did nothing wrong. Harlan had carried the entire burden in silence now. The responsibility of finding the full truth rested entirely on me. Porch. I went back inside and sat down at the table, opening the journal again. This time I went slowly, examining every detail. These notes were not just thoughts. They were a timeline of escalating control. The constant inquiries about his finances, the growing demands to sign over administrative control, the strange conversations that created a shadow over a home that should have been safe. Porch. Near the back of the notebook, the pages felt thick. I noticed a subtle pocket sewn into the inner back cover that I had overlooked before. Inside, my fingers brushed against a stiff, folded sheet of paper. I pulled it out carefully. It was an official legal contract, completely unexecuted. There were no signatures, no initials, only a bold header printed across the top. Porch. Marital Asset Reallocation Agreement. Beneath the title, Harlan had penciled a single note in light, hesitant script. Need independent legal review before agreeing to anything. The room remained perfectly still, but everything became completely clear. The pressure was real. The timeline was documented. The attempt to force him into signing away his life's work was right here in my hands. Porch. And he had protected himself by securing his assets where no one else could reach them. I held the paper firmly. It was not just a document. It was clear evidence of motive. By the following morning, the reality of my loss felt sharper, settling into a quiet, unwavering resolve. Porch. I was sitting at the table with the notebook and the unsigned document resting beneath a simple folder when a loud, forceful knock rattled my front door. It was not the hesitant, respectful knock of someone offering condolences. It was deliberate, heavy, and demanding. I closed the folder over the papers and stood up. Porch. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a familiar voice calling my name from the porch with casual entitlement. I opened the door to find a coordinated group standing on my steps. Leonard Hayes stood at the front, flanked by Patricia, and behind them stood a man wearing a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a thick leather legal folio. Their attorney. Porch. He had the sharp, calculating posture of someone who viewed personal tragedy strictly as an opportunity for financial leverage. Not one of them showed a single trace of grief. "May we come in?" Leonard asked, but he did not wait for an invitation. He brushed past me into the foyer, his dress shoes clicking sharply against my floor. Porch. Patricia followed right behind, gripping her designer handbag, while the attorney closed the door quietly behind them. The tension in the living room was immediate. I did not offer them seats, but they sat down anyway. Leonard crossed one leg over the other and adjusted his cuffs. Porch. Patricia straightened her jacket as if attending a board meeting, and the lawyer placed his folio flat on the table, folding his hands over the leather. I remained standing, watching them in silence. "Let us get right to the point," Leonard began, his voice carrying the calm arrogance of a man used to giving orders. "Porch. There are several urgent legal and financial matters that must be settled immediately." Patricia nodded in agreement. "We need to ensure there is no unnecessary confusion. Full transparency is essential for everyone involved." Hearing the word transparency from people who operated entirely in calculated moves was almost absurd. I kept my face completely blank, letting the silence hang in the air. "Porch." The lawyer cleared his throat. "We are here today to conduct a formal review of all financial activity and transactions initiated by your son in the 48 hours leading up to his passing." He said the word passing with the same emotional weight one would use to read a line item on an invoice. I walked over and sat down across from them, resting my hands quietly in my lap. "Porch." Leonard leaned forward slightly. "This is standard legal procedure. We require full access to his primary banking accounts, recent wire logs, and any documentation regarding transfers of assets or proprietary holdings." Patricia added in a practiced, reasonable tone, "You must understand how estate law functions. Everything he built during the marriage constitutes marital property." Porch. Their entitlement filled the room like smoke. I looked at each of them, studying their eyes. There was no sadness, no loss, only cold calculation. They were watching my face, searching for panic, weakness, or hesitation. For the first time, I saw them exactly as my son had seen them in those final weeks. It was never about family. It was entirely about control. Porch. The lawyer opened his folio, drew out a formal legal notice, and slid it slowly across the wooden table. "I understand this is an overwhelming time for you," he said in a measured voice. "But any capital or assets touched prior to his passing must be placed under the administration of the surviving spouse." I did not touch the paper. Porch. I did not lean forward to read it, and I did not ask a single question. I simply let their own urgency fill the silence. Leonard exhaled sharply, his patience beginning to wear thin against my calm. "We need your full cooperation right now, Josephine." Their posture, their demands, and their haste only confirmed the truth. They had not come here to offer support. Porch. They had come to collect what they believed they had successfully secured. The lawyer sat up straighter, locking his hands together as he delivered their final position. "The law requires the immediate return and accounting of all assets transferred immediately prior to his death." The demand hung in the air between us, cold and direct. Porch. I did not flinch, I did not shift in my chair, and I never looked down at the document on the table. Silence, when used with purpose, can be deafening. It carries more weight than anger, more power than an argument, and more clarity than grief. In that moment, my silence filled every corner of the room. Leonard leaned back, casting a brief, uneasy glance toward Patricia. "Porch. They had expected tears, confusion, and panic. Instead, they were met with absolute, unshakable composure. The lawyer tapped the paper with the tip of his pen. "We need your active cooperation if we are going to resolve this matter smoothly." I blinked slowly, looking directly into his eyes, but remained completely silent. Sierra, who had been standing near the hallway, finally snapped. "Torch." Her sweet, composed demeanor completely vanished as her voice cut through the room with sharp anger. "We drove all the way out here. The very least you can do is give us an answer." I kept my hands resting quietly in my lap, allowing the pressure in the room to build. Leonard leaned in once more, his tone hardening with a sharp edge. "Torch, you are fully aware of your son's legal obligations to his estate, are you not?" I did not say a word. The lawyer attempted a softer, more persuasive approach. "We recognize the difficulty of the circumstances, but these financial disclosures cannot be delayed. Complete transparency is required by law." The continued silence began to visibly unravel their composure. Torch. Sierra was the first to lose control entirely. Her voice rose to a frantic, furious pitch that echoed off the walls. "He promised all of that to me, not to you." Patricia went completely still beside her, startled by her daughter's sudden outburst. Sierra did not care. Torch. Her eyes were wild with desperation, looking not like a grieving widow, but like someone watching an entire fortune slip right through her fingers. I looked at her with total clarity. Her words carried no power, they only exposed the truth of why they were there. Leonard reached out, grabbed his daughter's wrist with a tight, firm grip, and pulled her back, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "Torch, control yourself." The attorney leaned back, studying me with a fresh layer of suspicion. "Mrs. Blake," he paused, carefully measuring every syllable. "We are simply trying to keep this from becoming complicated." Complicated. My thoughts drifted right back to the very last moment I held my son's hand, his fingers trembling under that dinner table, the bloodshot, strained look in his eyes. "Torch." That faint, fragile whisper that had barely left his lips. "Do not trust anyone, please." Those words had not just echoed in my ears. They had taken root. They were anchoring me right now, keeping my voice locked inside where no one could twist it. My silence was not weakness. It was my armor. Leonard let out a heavy, impatient breath. "This is not optional for you. Torch. Do you understand that?" His tone hardened. He was married. His life was tied to our family. His assets, his accounts, his investments, they are all part of the marital estate. I did not flinch. Sierra let out an exaggerated scoff and rolled her eyes. "She is playing dumb. She always acts like she mattered more to him than anyone else." Her voice turned vicious. "He told me everything. Torch. He promised me everything." There it was. The first crack. The first sign that her composure was slipping. They all felt it. Patricia subtly nudged her daughter with an elbow, trying to pull her back in line, but it was too late. Sierra's greed was out in the open, raw, and unhinged. The lawyer cut in before another outburst could derail them. "Torch. We need to establish whether any transfers were executed, accounts, wires, assets, anything that changed title in the final 48 hours. 48 hours. The exact window of that dinner, the transfer they knew nothing about, the $50 million Harlan had placed safely in my hands. Silence remained my shield. The lawyer raised his pen, waiting. "Mrs. Blake, please cooperate." "Torch. We need your response." I finally looked straight into his eyes. There was no fear in my gaze, only the cold, steady resolve of a mother who understood the devastating power of holding her tongue. He was the first to break eye contact. My complete lack of reaction rattled them far more than anger ever could. Leonard's jaw tightened. "If you refuse to cooperate, you leave us no choice. Torch. We will escalate this." Sierra leaned forward, her eyes glinting with malice. "You really do not want to start a battle you cannot win." I stayed silent. The attorney slowly closed his folder and exhaled through his nose, putting on the act of a professional making a difficult, reluctant decision. Torch. He slipped the paperwork back into his briefcase, clicked the brass locks shut, and rose from his chair. "Fine," he said, adjusting his tie. He stared down at me with hard finality. "If that is how you want to handle this, we will see you in court." Once they walked out, the house settled back into an eerie quiet. It was so still that the walls seemed to carry the faint echoes of their footsteps. Porch. I locked the front door behind them and walked straight back to the dining table. The black notebook was still resting beneath the folder, waiting like a silent witness. When I picked it up, my hands were no longer shaking. I had moved past that. I had entered a different kind of calm, the kind that only comes when profound grief fuses with an absolute determination for the truth. Porch. I opened the journal again, but this time not just to read. I was investigating. Every page held far more than simple words. The dates scribbled in the margins, the faint indentations, the rushed lines born out of frustration, the heavy ink where he had pressed the pen hard against the paper. I began laying everything out across the table. Porch. One entry documented the escalating pressure from his in-laws 3 weeks before that dinner. A note detailing an unauthorized update to his life insurance policy, dated 12 days before that night. A hurried paragraph about Sierra's sudden, aggressive interest in his company's valuation, written 9 days prior. Porch. And a note about Leonard Hayes demanding he sign comprehensive family asset restructuring forms dated 5 days out. Page by page, detail by detail. Individually, these notes were just private anxieties. But laid side by side, they formed an undeniable timeline of calculated intent. Then I matched those entries against the facts I already held. Porch. The altered insurance beneficiary designations, the discussions he had documented about sudden policy changes, the records of high-end club expenses billed to shared accounts for events he never attended, and the flurry of unfamiliar incoming calls logged during his final days. When cross-referenced with his journal, every piece aligned with surgical precision. A pattern. Their pattern. Porch. These were not grieving family members. These were predators waiting for a transaction to clear. I leaned back slowly as the full weight of the reality settled in. This did not look like a tragic accident. It did not feel like one, and it certainly did not operate like one. It moved with the calculated efficiency of a coordinated setup. My phone vibrated softly on the table. Porch. A call from an unknown number. I took a steady breath before answering. A low, hurried voice spoke on the other end. "Mrs. Blake? It is Eric, from Harlan's office." Eric was the lead developer who had worked countless late nights beside my son, helping him build the technology company Harlan was so proud of. I did not know who else to reach out to. His voice wavered. "Porch, I have to tell you something, but please, keep my name out of this." I closed my eyes and steadied myself. "Go ahead, Eric." He let out a shaky breath. The night before everything happened, he came into my office. He asked me to review a legal document with him. He said something felt terribly wrong. My pulse slowed to a heavy, deliberate rhythm. "Porch." He was being pressured to sign something that night, Eric continued. He did not want to, but they had backed him into a corner. Mrs. Blake, he looked completely worn down, exhausted, like a part of him was ready to give in just to buy himself a single day of peace. I gripped the phone tightly. "He told me not to worry," Eric whispered. "Porch." He said he had already moved the most critical assets to the only person in the world he trusted completely. The most critical assets. The transfer. I swallowed hard and thanked him before he quickly hung up, terrified of being overheard. After the line went dead, I sat in silence for a long time, hands folded, regulating my breath. Porch. My son had been fighting this entire battle completely alone, keeping every burden locked inside to shield me while trying to protect what he had built, until the walls closed in around him. I reached for the notebook once more, turning carefully toward the final pages, cautious not to damage the worn binding. Something slipped out from between the last 2 sheets. Porch. A thin, torn fragment of paper with a jagged edge. I picked it up with 2 fingers. The paper had been ripped in haste. A sharp, angled ink stroke cut across the surface. It was half of a signature, Harlan's signature. My heart tightened. This was not a casual note or a journal entry. This was physical evidence of a confrontation, proof that he had pulled back, proof that he had refused to yield to their demands. The torn scrap rested firmly in my hand. By the next morning, that torn scrap of paper carried more weight than the entire notebook. I placed it inside a clear protective sleeve from my desk drawer, treating it not just as a keepsake, but as critical evidence. I had not eaten, and I had not slept. I was moving purely on focus, calm, steady, and deliberate. There was only one person I trusted to properly evaluate what this meant legally. Mr. Holt, Harlan's original personal attorney. Not the corporate firm retained by the Hayes family, and not a business associate of Leonard's, but the independent counsel Harlan had hired years ago when his startup was just beginning, before outside interests had cast a shadow over his success. I called his office, and the controlled urgency in my voice was enough for him to clear his morning schedule immediately. As I drove into the city, the sky hung low and overcast, draped in a heavy gray mist that clung to the pavement. When I arrived at his downtown office, the receptionist escorted me straight into his private conference room without hesitation. Mr. Holt stood up as I entered, genuine sorrow etched across his face. "Josephine, I am so terribly sorry for your loss," he said softly. I gave a brief nod, entirely focused on why I was there. I placed the black journal on his mahogany desk, then slid the protective sleeve containing the torn document toward him. He adjusted his glasses and picked up the sleeve carefully, inspecting the jagged edges before examining the sharp, half-finished signature. His expression shifted. It was not dramatic shock, but a tightening around his mouth and a deep furrow in his brow, the subtle reaction of a veteran attorney, recognizing something deeply problematic. "Where did you find this?" he asked, tucked inside the back of his personal journal. He let out a long, quiet breath. "This," he tapped the plastic sleeve lightly, "is a fragment of an irrevocable marital asset restructuring agreement. The kind of legal instrument used to immediately transfer voting rights and executive authority in the event of incapacitation or sudden passing. Passing. The word landed between us like cold stone. He examined Harlan's handwriting on the torn edge, checking the margin notes. Then he turned to his bookshelf, pulled down a dense reference binder of standard corporate templates, and laid the fragment alongside them. The formatting and clause headers aligned perfectly. He closed the binder slowly, the atmosphere in the room growing dense. "This was not just standard financial planning," Holt said. "This shows extensive, calculated coordination." A cold ache tightened in my chest. I pressed my hands flat against my lap, keeping my voice steady. Holt lowered his voice. "Your son never completed this document. That is why it was torn. He hesitated, or he outright refused when the pressure was applied, and someone tried to force his hand. He turned the sleeve over in his hands. Look at the tear. One edge is clean, but the rest is ripped violently. This was pulled away during an active dispute." I looked at the paper, absorbing every word with absolute clarity. Holt set the document down, folded his hands, and leaned forward. "Mrs. Blake, I have to be completely candid with you. They were not just maneuvering for a larger share of the estate. They were positioning themselves for immediate, total administrative control over his liquid capital, his intellectual property, and his equity portfolio." He paused, his eyes carrying a grave intensity. "They accelerated the timeline to seize control before he could formally revoke their access or challenge the agreements." A deep chill ran down my spine. Not shock, confirmation. The journal entries, Leonard's unrelenting pressure, Sierra's calculated questions, the altered policy records, and the private confrontations Harlan had documented. Every single gear locked into place. I said nothing. The silence between us was different from the silence I gave his in-laws. This was the quiet resolve of a mother who had stepped past grief and into absolute certainty. Holt noticed. He reached toward the journal. "May I review the full timeline?" I nodded. He turned through the pages, reviewing the sequence of dates and private notes Harlan had kept. Some were written in clean, steady lines. Others were rushed and heavy, reflecting the immense pressure closing in on him. Holt read several entries under his breath, his eyes narrowing with every recorded date. George. He closed the notebook with immense care and rested his palm on the cover. Josephine, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a courtroom veteran, this is not just a personal diary. He turned the book slightly so the cover faced me. This is an evidentiary record capable of dismantling their entire legal standing. George. The drive back from Holt's office was the first time in days that my vision remained completely clear. The pain had not faded, but something inside me had shifted sharply, like a heavy deadbolt clicking into place. For days, grief had felt like a suffocating weight. But now, my lungs were filled with purpose. I kept the journal on the passenger seat right next to the sealed document sleeve. The cool air from the vents stirred the edges of the plastic. My son had left a clear, unmistakable trail. The scattered notes, the timelines, the dates that seemed minor on their own, now formed an unbroken chain of evidence that cleared away every doubt. They had not just taken advantage of him. They had designed a calculated strategy, entirely convinced that no one would ever have the evidence to expose it. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. Before stepping out, my hand rested on the keys. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows against the gray pavement. It was the kind of evening that should have brought peace. It brought none. Parked across the street was a vehicle I recognized immediately. Leonard Hayes's black luxury sedan with dark-tinted windows. The engine was off, but the car was angled directly toward my front walkway, watching the house. The interior was empty. My pulse remained steady, sharp, and focused. I tucked the journal beneath my arm and walked up the steps with measured, deliberate strides. Just as I locked the front door behind me, I heard voices. Not inside my house, but drifting through the narrow strip of lawn that separated my home from the property. Harlan had shared with Sierra. One of their side windows was cracked open, carrying their words clearly through the evening air. I moved silently to my side window and eased it open a fraction of an inch. The conversation became indistinct. We have to get ahead of this before any third party starts asking questions, Leonard Hayes said, his voice tight with frustration. A pause. A heavy sigh followed by pacing footsteps. Patricia's voice followed, sharp and agitated. Her complete silence is throwing everything off. She is not reacting the way she should. Something went wrong. Then, Sierra's brother spoke up, his tone rushed and anxious. She knows something. I am telling you, I could see it on her face. My hands rested quietly on the sill. I kept my breathing completely even. Their words brought no surprise, only absolute confirmation. They were not in mourning. They were scrambling to secure their narrative. More footsteps echoed from within the house, followed by the scrape of a chair across hardwood. We need to ensure the primary instruments are fully recognized, Leonard muttered. Without formal verification, that unexecuted agreement is useless to us. There has to be another way to compel compliance. Another way. Their desperation was no longer a theory. It was an active, coordinated effort unraveling under pressure. I stepped away from the window, letting their voices fade. My focus was razor sharp. I picked up my bag, locked my front door, and walked across the grass separating the two properties. Their front door was resting slightly ajar, left unlatched as if someone had just stepped out and intended to return momentarily. Warm light spilled across the threshold. I paused on the porch, listening. Their voices were coming from the rear living room, hushed in heated discussion. The front entryway was completely deserted. This was not about hesitation. It was about securing the full truth. I slipped inside without making a sound, moving toward the foyer, but I did not need to step into the living room. What caught my attention was laid out across the dining room table. Documents. Piles of corporate folders and estate files were spread wide across the polished wood, messy and unorganized. They had never anticipated anyone walking into the house unannounced. Their overconfidence had made them careless. Porch. Right in the center, weighed down beneath a ceramic coaster, was a stack of life insurance adjustment filings. I recognized the corporate letterhead instantly, and then I saw it. At the bottom of the authorization page was Harlan's printed name, followed by a signature. It was a blatant forgery, practiced, smooth, and entirely foreign to my son's natural hand. They had not even bothered to file it out of sight. My throat tightened, not from sorrow, but from a cold, absolute anger that demanded justice. I reached into my bag, drew out my phone, and lined up the camera. My hands did not waver for a single second. Click. The first page. Click. The secondary clauses. Click. A clean, high-resolution, close-up capturing the fraudulent signature directly beside the execution date. The date was printed clearly, the evening before he passed away. Everything inside me hardened into unbreakable certainty. I captured one final wide frame, ensuring every document and letterhead was perfectly legible. Just as footsteps began approaching from the back corridor, I slipped out the front door like a shadow. I pulled the heavy door shut behind me until it clicked securely into place. My phone gave a single quiet vibration as the images uploaded to secure storage. The insurance documents, the forged signature, the timestamp, undeniable proof. Early the following morning, the summons arrived. A formal, coldly worded text from Leonard Hayes. Family conference scheduled for 3 this afternoon. Legal counsel will be present. Attendance required, as though I answered to their commands, as though I were bound to their authority. I looked at the message with total clarity. It was not intimidation. It was their deep-seated assumption that I remained the same broken, overwhelmed mother from the day of the incident. They believed silence meant surrender. They were about to learn that silence is sometimes a strategy. At exactly 2:59, I stepped into the living room of the Hayes residence. The air was thick with expensive cologne, heavy perfume, and unearned entitlement. The seating had been arranged in a precise semicircle, with one noticeably lower chair placed right in the center, positioned for an interrogation. I chose to remain standing. Leonard Hayes sat upright, his legs crossed, hands resting flat on his knees with the posture of an executive managing a hostile takeover. Patricia sat beside him, tapping her manicured nails impatiently against the armrest. Sierra sat rigid, her lips drawn into a tight, bloodless line. Their attorney sat with a thick legal folio balanced across his knees, ready to control the room. "You are late," Sierra said coldly. "I am 1 minute early," I replied, stating the plain fact without an ounce of emotion. Leonard cleared his throat. "Let us begin. We have shown considerable patience, but this impasse ends today. Several pressing legal instruments must be executed immediately." The lawyer opened his binder. Full cooperation is the only way to avoid formal legal intervention. Their confident demeanor did not match the anxiety simmering beneath the surface. They leaned far too heavily on the word legal, hiding their desperation behind tailored suits and rehearsed lines. "We require administrative credentials for every corporate and private account tied to Harlan," Leonard stated firmly. "Transaction logs, routing numbers, and all outstanding balance declarations." Patricia nodded sharply. "It is the standard and proper course of action." Sierra lifted her chin. "He made it clear that everything belonged to our household. You have no legal right to withhold estate information." I stood in place, completely unmoved. The attorney let out a tired sigh and tapped his pen against the paper. "Mrs. Blake, your continued refusal to communicate is complicating an otherwise straightforward estate resolution." I let them continue speaking. Sierra leaned forward, her voice trembling with rising frustration. "You are letting emotion cloud your judgment. That is exactly why financial administration must transfer to us. You are simply not in a state of mind to oversee these matters." Patricia added smoothly, "You are grieving, dear. You should leave these complex affairs to the people equipped to manage substantial capital. George. Leonard offered a measured, condescending tone. It is nothing personal, Josephine. It is purely practical. You simply lack the background to oversee an estate of this magnitude. There it was. The thinly veiled pressure disguised as concern, the calculated manipulation wrapped in the language of sympathy. Every word was designed to force compliance. I did not even blink. George. The lawyer slid a fresh document toward the edge of the table. This represents your final opportunity to cooperate before we initiate formal probate proceedings. Sierra folded her arms. Stop acting like you do not know this was the plan all along. He promised me the estate. He promised me full security. Leonard nodded in agreement. George, your interference is only delaying the inevitable legal outcome. Patricia tilted her head. We offered you a seat at the table, but you clearly failed to grasp how these corporate structures work. I held my silence. It was the one response they had no script for. The attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ma'am, if you refuse to engage, this matter proceeds directly to litigation. George, you are actively obstructing the process. I took a single, steady breath. It was calm, measured, and resolute. Then, without dramatic flair or raised voices, I moved. I reached into my bag, withdrew the black moleskine journal, and laid it flat in the center of the table. The worn black cover seemed to drain the energy straight out of the room. The lawyer blinked. Leonard went completely rigid. George. Sierra caught her breath, and Patricia's tapping fingers froze in midair. The room fell dead silent. Every facade shattered at once. What is that? Leonard whispered, his voice losing its polished composure. I did not answer him directly. I let the presence of the journal speak for itself. It sat there, an unyielding record of the truth they had tried so hard to bury. George. Leonard's jaw muscles twitched. Sierra gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Even the attorney leaned in, an unmistakable flash of panic crossing his face. I opened the front cover. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely steady. I turned to the first key entry and began reading aloud, my voice low, clear, and perfectly even. George. They asked again today for a full breakdown of my personal liquid assets. Why the sudden obsession with my valuation? Sierra's eyes widened in horror. Patricia stopped breathing. I turned a page. The executive life insurance policy was modified again today. No explanation provided, not requested by me. Leonard sat bolt upright, clearing his throat to interrupt. George. Before he could speak, I continued reading. My father-in-law is demanding I execute new corporate governance forms. Claims it is routine family planning. None of the terms align with standard practice. A visible fracture cracked through Sierra's composure. The attorney opened his mouth to object, but I simply raised a single hand, silencing him instantly without uttering an extra word. George. I did not rush. I allowed every recorded sentence to land with absolute weight. I turned another page. She demanded all master administrative passwords today, claimed it was for contingency access. Why now? Sierra shifted violently in her seat, a deep, guilty flush rising up her neck. Another turn of the page. Continuous pressure regarding personal account control. George. The hostility in this house is becoming unmanageable. Their manufactured confidence completely unraveled. I paused, leaving the journal open for all of them to see. I looked at each of them in turn. The color had drained from their faces, their superiority collapsing into undeniable fear. Then I reached the entry dated 5 days before that final dinner. Policy terms expanded again. George. Payout terms increased significantly. Executed without my written consent. Leonard attempted to speak. That is taken out of context. Before he could finish, I reached into my folder and slid the high-resolution photographs across the polished table. The unauthorized policy adjustments, the fraudulent signature, and the timestamp displayed in clear, undeniable focus. George. The attorney grabbed the photos with desperate haste, scanning the page as the color completely vanished from his face. Harlan's name was there, but the signature was an obvious, amateur forgery. I turned to the next entry. He informed me that the agreements must be finalized tomorrow. Said, I have no alternatives. I am being actively cornered. A broken gasp escaped Sierra's lips. Torch. Leonard threw her a sharp, threatening glare, but her composure was already in pieces. Patricia tried to find her voice. You are misrepresenting private notes, she stammered. I looked right past her. Torch. Page after page, date after date, the journal laid out the exact scheme they believed had been kept in the dark. The relentless financial pressure, the unauthorized policy changes, the forged documentation, and the final ultimatums delivered behind closed doors. Every step of their plan had been preserved in ink. The attorney swallowed hard. These are subjective personal notations. Torch. I reached into my bag one last time and placed the protective sleeve containing the torn document directly on top of the photographs. The jagged edge and the incomplete signature were unmistakable. The lawyer stared at the fragment, his eyes narrowing as absolute panic settled into the lines of his face. He refused to complete the agreement, I said calmly. He tore the document in half. Torch. Leonard lunged forward in his chair. That proves nothing in a court of law. I met his gaze with cold, unshakable clarity. Finally, I turned to the final entry, dated the evening of that last dinner. The ink was dark, pressed deep into the paper. They are demanding execution tonight. Everything has been redirected. It is safe with Mom. Sierra's breathing fractured completely. Torch. Patricia covered her mouth with trembling hands. Leonard's eyes darted frantically, searching for an exit that did not exist. Their attorney slowly closed his folio, knowing the matter was entirely out of his hands. I closed the journal gently, smoothing the worn edge of the cover with my thumb. My voice remained steady, carrying the quiet authority of absolute truth. Torch. My son did not survive to deliver this testimony himself, I said softly. You planned to take everything he built. But what mattered most is we are entirely out of your reach. For a long moment, nobody in that room dared to breathe. The open evidence lay between us like a formal indictment. The photographs of the forged documents glowed starkly under the overhead lighting. Torch. The three members of the Hayes family, who had entered the room convinced of their absolute dominance, sat completely paralyzed, stripped of every ounce of leverage. Sierra looked ashen, her lips trembling between frantic excuses and total shock. Torch. Patricia gripped her handbag until the leather creased, while Leonard sat frozen, looking like a man who had watched the ground vanish from beneath his feet. Even their legal counsel could no longer maintain the illusion. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. He wiped it away with a trembling hand, scribbling meaningless lines across his legal pad just to avoid making eye contact. This is, Torch, an extraordinary misunderstanding. Leonard finally managed to force out, though his voice sounded thin, frail, and entirely hollow. I gave him no answer. He swallowed hard and looked desperately toward his attorney. The lawyer sat up, clearing his throat in a weak attempt to salvage their position. These entries remain unverified, he said, grasping at straws. Torch. Handwriting analysis, subjective emotional interpretations, we simply do not have the complete context. I reached slowly into my handbag. The lawyer's half-formed excuse caught instantly in his throat. I drew out another envelope. It was thin, folded twice for privacy, with neat and careful handwriting across the front. I laid it flat right next to the journal. Torch. Leonard stared at it as if it were a live wire. What is that? His voice came out raspy and strained. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Every person at that table leaned forward at the exact same time. This, I said calmly, is from the neighbor who saw Harlan pacing outside that night. The neighbor who watched him hold his chest in distress. Torch. And the same neighbor who noticed another vehicle parked near the garage. Sierra bolted upright in her seat. That is a lie. Patricia seized her daughter's arm with a tight grip. Be quiet, she hissed under her breath. Leonard's eyes narrowed to sharp slits. What neighbor? I turned the page around so the statement faced them directly. It was not long. It did not need to be. Torch. At approximately 11:34 that evening, I observed Mr. Harlan Blake pacing the sidewalk while on the phone. A dark sedan pulled up near the garage area. The driver stepped out, approached the side entrance of the property, and remained there for several minutes. I clearly recognized the individual as his father-in-law, Leonard Hayes. Sierra gasped, the sound catching in her throat. Ouch. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, while every drop of color drained completely from Leonard's face. Their attorney froze, his breath hitching. He picked up the page with trembling fingers and scanned the lines frantically, as if praying the words might rearrange themselves into something harmless. "You called it an unfortunate accident," I said in a quiet, steady voice. Ouch. He was not alone out there. Leonard slammed his open palm against the table. "No, I was not there. This does not establish anything." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, broken not by grief, but by sheer panic. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Nobody dared to speak. Every exit they had planned to use, legal, emotional, or procedural, was completely cut off. Ouch. The attorney's breathing turned rapid and shallow. He wiped his forehead again, smearing the cold sweat across his brow. All of this, he attempted to argue, though his voice had lost all authority, is entirely circumstantial. We cannot draw definitive conclusions from unverified claims. I looked directly at him with calm, unwavering focus. He dropped his gaze immediately. Ouch. Patricia Hayes let out a trembling whisper. "We never intended for things to turn out like this. We only needed to secure." "Patricia, that is enough," Leonard snapped. The damage was already done. That half-spoken confession hung heavily in the air. The lawyer was scribbling across his legal pad now, his pen scratching frantically against the paper. "Ouch. This has gone entirely off course," he muttered under his breath. "This meeting was not structured for this." I did not say a word. I did not have to. The journal entries, the photographs of the forged documents, and the formal witness statement spoke with far more force than any argument ever could. Ouch. In that moment, they finally understood that they were not facing an overwhelmed mother lost in grief. They were facing an undeniable record of the truth. The attorney leaned toward Leonard, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We need to end this meeting right now." Immediately. The gathering did not close with shouting or slammed doors. Ouch. It ended in complete, paralyzing silence, the cold reality of accountability settling over them like a tightening net. When I stepped out of their house, I did not rush. I walked with steady, deliberate steps, holding the journal securely against my chest, carrying the weight my son had borne alone for far too long. By sunrise the next morning, the momentum had completely shifted. Before I had even finished my morning tea, Mr. Holt called my phone. "Bring everything you have to the office," he said. "Right now." His tone carried urgency, not of panic, but of clear, decisive action. Ouch. I gathered the black journal, the protective sleeve with the torn agreement, the photographs of the altered insurance filings, and the signed neighbor's statement, placing each item neatly into a secure folder. Evidence deserved absolute precision. Ouch. When I arrived at Holt's downtown office, he had already assembled a specialized team, including insurance fraud examiners, a senior forensic accountant, and a retired lead investigator, experienced in complex liability cases. The documents were spread across the large conference table, each piece locking into place. Ouch. One fraud investigator, wearing white inspection gloves, examined the insurance authorization form. "This signature is clearly fabricated," she stated without hesitation. "The line quality is far too smooth, far too deliberate. It is an obvious attempt to replicate his handwriting style." Another analyst reviewed the torn contract. Ouch. "The pressure marks near the signature line indicate severe hesitation." He began the initial stroke and pulled back sharply. "That aligns directly with signing under duress." The forensics accountant aligned the financial logs across the table. Ouch. A long sequence of unauthorized balance inquiries, transfer attempts, and credential resets matched the exact dates and times Harlan had recorded feeling cornered in his journal. Every digital timestamp mirrored his personal notes. The retired investigator leaned over the layout, reviewing the timeline in silence. "This has moved far beyond a civil dispute," he said quietly. "George. This points to coordinated financial coercion. They crossed several severe legal thresholds." Holt looked across the table at me. "Are you prepared for the formal proceedings ahead?" I gave a single firm nod. The moment I realized my son had stood alone against this pressure, I had crossed past hesitation. There was no looking back. George. The team organized the documentation into formal evidentiary files and sealed them. Holt drove the primary submission to the district authorities, and I followed behind in my own car, hands steady on the wheel. It did not feel like entering a battle. It felt like bringing my son's truth into the light where it belonged. At the department, investigators escorted us into a private conference room. George. Detectives from the Major Case Division reviewed each document, photograph, and timestamp, asking precise, measured questions. "When was this entry recorded? When did you locate this fragment? When did you overhear the discussion between the parties? When were these photographs taken?" George. The timeline closed around Leonard Hayes and his family with absolute precision. The forged insurance documents, the unexecuted asset agreements, the formal witness placement at the scene, and the documented pattern of intimidation written in Harlan's own hand. Step by step, the entire scheme was documented on the record. By late afternoon, the department was moving with focused momentum. George. Officers processed copies, while investigators moved between offices with a sense of urgency that only comes when the truth is undeniable. Holt placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "You handled this with exceptional strength," he said. I stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The sky had softened into a gentle dusk, long clouds stretching across the distant horizon. Porch. Across the avenue stood the county courthouse, its stone steps reflecting the fading amber light. I walked a few paces from the entrance, letting the cool evening air brush against my face. In that quiet space, between the immense pain of the past days and the legal proceedings about to unfold, I felt a deep, steady warmth settle beneath my ribs. It was the memory of my boy. Porch. Not a shadow, not a whisper, but a comforting presence that finally allowed me to take a full, deep breath. "I did this for you," I said softly. It was not just a promise, it was a completed duty. Behind me, the station doors opened as a detail of officers moved out with practiced coordination, stepping into a line of unmarked units. Holt walked over, nodding toward the vehicles. "Porch. The formal warrants are being executed," he said. My heart held steady. Justice was finally in motion. Within the hour, law enforcement units pulled up along the manicured curb of the Hayes residence. Porch. Clear instructions were given, the entrance was secured, and Leonard Hayes was escorted down his front steps under formal arrest. His hands secured behind his back, his face frozen in utter shock at the consequences he had never believed would reach him. Real peace never arrives with noise. It settles in quietly, like a steady hand supporting you after a long, exhausting storm. Porch. As the weeks passed, the initial noise surrounding the legal filings began to quiet into routine court proceedings. The formal investigation continued to deepen. Court dates were officially set, and the Hayes family found themselves surrounded by defense counsel, facing the very accountability they had spent months trying to avoid. I never spoke ill of them in public. Porch. Not to the investigators, not to reporters, and not to the neighbors. I simply provided the facts under oath and allowed the justice system to carry out its work. Instead, I focused all my energy on honoring the memory of the young man who had trusted me until the very end. Porch. The $50 million Harlan had transferred to my account, his final act of protection, could not remain sitting in a private balance. I knew the weight it carried, the urgency behind it, and the hope he held when he passed that phone to me under the dinner table. I spent weeks consulting with financial advisors, meeting with charitable directors, and working alongside Mr. Porch. Holt to design something enduring that would transform a painful chapter into a lasting foundation for others. In the end, only one path felt entirely right. I used the capital to establish an independent foundation in his name, dedicated to supporting talented young innovators and creators who come from humble beginnings. Torch. People with brilliant visions who simply need an honest opportunity rather than a corporate trap. I named the foundation after him, free from any mention of the legal battles or the shadows that had surrounded his final days. It was built purely on promise, creativity, and opportunity. On the morning of the foundation's official launch, I stood quietly at the back of the auditorium, watching the first group of grant recipients speak on stage. Seeing the hope and ambition in their eyes brought a quiet warmth to my chest that replaced the lingering sorrow with purpose. I did not need recognition or praise. I only wanted Harlan's legacy to live on. Later that week, I placed the black journal inside my bag and drove out to the quiet cemetery. The path to his resting place was familiar now. The gentle curve of the stone walkway, the tall oak tree providing steady shade, and the small bouquets left by visitors honoring loved ones. I walked up to the headstone where his name was carved deep and clean into the granite. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the lawn. I knelt down beside the stone and rested the journal on my lap, my thumb tracing the worn leather edge and the soft creases along the spine. The cover opened easily to the very first page, where his young, ambitious handwriting stretched across the paper. I think Mom is going to be proud of me today. Got the formal promotion. Taking her out for a proper dinner soon. She worked so hard for us. I really like who I am becoming. My breath caught on that last sentence. That was Harlan before the pressure began, before the invasive demands, before the calculated contracts, before he was cornered by people who saw him only as leverage, and long before fear had entered his home. That was my son, unburdened, ambitious, and standing fully in the light of his own future. I read the entry out loud into the quiet air, letting the words carry across the grass so he could hear them, and so I could hear them one more time. When I finished, I held the book against my chest for a long moment. Then, with gentle care, I set the journal down upon the soft grass right beneath his name. It rested there quietly, the final record returned to where it belonged. I am leaving this here with you, I whispered. Every recorded date, every documented concern, every piece of the truth. You entrusted me with everything you built, and I protected it exactly as you asked. A cool, steady breeze passed over the lawn, calm and comforting. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth in my chest settle into a deep, lasting peace. I stood up, smoothed the grass around the stone, adjusted the flowers, and rested my hand one last time against the cool granite where Harlan Blake's name was carved. With all the strength I had left, I spoke softly to the quiet morning. You gave me your truth, and I made sure justice was served.